There are some friendships that words struggle to contain. Friendships built not in boardrooms or backstage lounges, but on cold bus rides through gray city mornings, on shared dreams that most people around you think are foolish, on music that becomes a language you speak when ordinary conversation falls short. Paul McCartney and George Harrison had that kind of friendship. And for decades, much of what Paul truly felt about George, the full, complicated, grief-stained truth of it, stayed largely unspoken. But in recent years, something has shifted. Paul McCartney, now in his 80s and still releasing music that draws on the deepest wells of his memory, has begun to open up about George Harrison in ways he never quite did before. Not in polished press statements, not in carefully managed interviews designed to protect a legacy, but in quiet, personal moments on radio programs and documentary footage, in the liner notes of new albums, where the guard comes down and the real man emerges. What he has said is not a simple tribute. It is something richer and more honest than that. To understand what Paul McCartney has finally started to say about George Harrison, you have to go back to where it all began. Not the concerts, not the recording sessions, not the chaos of Beatlemania. You have to go back to a bus. Paul McCartney and George Harrison both attended the Liverpool Institute High School for Boys. Paul was a year older, already known among his peers as quick-witted and musically gifted. George was younger, quieter, and by his own account deeply unhappy in the rigid school environment. The classroom held nothing for him. But on the long bus rides into the city, with the school rules falling away and guitars coming out of cases, something different happened between these two boys. He was younger than me. McCartney has said, "We went to the same school. We used to get the same bus in the morning to school." Just the idea of knowing him before there was a Beatles and before he was in the Beatles. Then just the idea of him and me hitchhiking around the country. The friendship that gets us very deep. We had some great times together, and then it goes on, and it becomes the Beatles and all that crazy madness. It's beautiful. That word, beautiful, carries a lot of weight coming from Paul McCartney. He doesn't use it carelessly. And when he says about those early days with George, you sense that he means it in the truest possible way. That the simplicity of that friendship, before the fame and the pressure and the business and the falling out, is something he has spent his whole life trying to understand and hold on to. It was Paul who introduced George to John Lennon and the Quarrymen. Lennon was skeptical of the young, baby-faced kid Paul was vouching for. But when George auditioned, playing a note-perfect version of a tricky guitar instrumental on the top deck of a Liverpool bus, Lennon could not argue. George was in. And just like that, Paul McCartney had done something that would shape the rest of music history. He had brought George Harrison into the fold, not just as a bandmate, but as a brother. As the Beatles rose from Liverpool club bands to the most famous group on earth, the friendship between Paul and George quietly complicated itself. Fame has a way of doing that. It takes something pure and puts pressure on it until the cracks appear. Paul McCartney became the driving creative engine of the band's later years. He pushed relentlessly for innovation. He orchestrated arrangements. He demanded perfection. These are not bad qualities in an artist. But in a band of four strong personalities, where creative space was finite and politics were real, Paul's dominance had consequences. And for George Harrison, the quietest Beatle, those consequences were painful. For years, George's songs were treated as secondary space fillers after the Lennon-McCartney catalog had taken its share of each album. George was writing. He was always writing. Songs like something, "While My Guitar Gently Weeps," "Here Comes the Sun," and "All Things Must Pass" were sitting in his notebooks, waiting. But the doors to the main room were often closed to him. Paul McCartney has since admitted, with what sounds like genuine discomfort, that he underestimated George. During a 2020 interview on the Howard Stern show, Stern raised the question directly. Paul did not deflect. "I think it was easy to underestimate George," he said, "because me and John had always written most of the stuff and had had most of the singles. George was a late bloomer as far as writing was concerned. He wasn't that interested in the beginning, but then he started to get interested, and boy, did he bloom. He wrote some of the greatest songs ever." There it is. The admission, not dressed up, not hedged. Paul McCartney telling the world that he did not see George Harrison clearly enough while they were still together, and that in hindsight, the oversight was significant. That kind of honesty from someone as guarded as McCartney is not nothing. It is, in fact, everything. The tension between Paul and George did not erupt in a single moment. It grew slowly, through 100 small episodes, through looks exchanged across recording consoles, and words swallowed before they could cause damage. But one of the clearest illustrations of how differently these two men experienced the world came during the Beatles' famous trip to India in 1968. George had been deeply immersed in Eastern philosophy and spirituality for years by that point. His interest in Indian music and meditation was not a phase. It was a genuine and life-altering transformation. For George, the trip to India to study transcendental meditation under Maharishi Mahesh Yogi was sacred. It was a thing he had been building toward. For Paul, it was different. McCartney has recalled the tension that arose when he tried to talk about the next album during the retreat. George, he said, would snap back. "We're not here to talk about music. We're here to meditate." Paul remembered calling back to him, "Calm down, Georgie boy," treating it as something that could be lightened with humor. But for George, there was nothing light about it. His spiritual path was not a detour. It was a destination. This fundamental difference in how the two men saw the world, Paul always looking forward to the next record, the next show, the next creative challenge, George increasingly looking inward and upward, created a distance between them that music alone could not bridge. By 1969, the tension had become unbearable. The filming of what would become the Let It Be documentary captured the friction in painful detail. In one notorious scene, Paul could be seen directing George on how to play a guitar part. In Paul's way, with Paul's vision, according to Paul's idea of what the song needed. George's response, delivered with a quiet that was somehow more devastating than shouting, became one of the most famous lines in Beatles history. "I'll play whatever you want to play," or "I won't play at all if you don't want me to. Whatever it is that will please you, I'll do it." And then on January 10th, 1969, George Harrison walked out. He left the rehearsal. He left the film set. He later said that being there had become very unhealthy and unhappy for him. He was gone for 12 days. When he returned, it was on his terms, with new conditions, including the removal of the sessions from the cavernous and acoustically miserable Twickenham film studios. But the break had already happened inside him. George channeled everything he felt into his music. His solo album, All Things Must Pass, released in 1970, was a revelation, a triple album of staggering beauty and depth that contained years of suppressed creative energy. When it dropped, it silenced every person who had ever suggested that George Harrison was the lesser songwriter in the Beatles. Paul McCartney publicly acknowledged the magnitude of what George achieved on that record. Speaking about Here Comes the Sun in particular, McCartney said that when George brought that song into the sessions, they loved it but were also genuinely challenged by it. The chord changes were complicated, the structure was sophisticated, and the emotion was so personal it demanded a certain kind of silence from everyone else in the room. He admitted that working on that song was a reminder just how much George had been quietly growing as a writer, developing at his own pace and in his own direction, entirely without the approval or encouragement he deserved. Time passed. The bitterness of the breakup softened, as bitterness usually does when it has nowhere new to go. By the early 1990s, Paul and George found themselves drawn back together, not by nostalgia, exactly, but by history. In February 1994, the three surviving Beatles, Paul, George, and Ringo Starr, gathered at McCartney's studio to work on unfinished John Lennon demos. The press called them the Threedles. Fans called it a miracle. But old patterns die hard. George arrived at the sessions with strong opinions and little patience for drift. He insisted his friend Jeff Lynne produce the tracks. He warned Paul directly, and Paul later recalled George's words. "No, we need a producer. It could be dangerous just to all get in the studio. Could get nasty. You've got egos flying around." Paul McCartney, telling that story, does not sound offended. He sounds like a man who recognizes that George Harrison saw him clearly. And maybe, by that point, Paul was beginning to see himself clearly too. The collaboration produced Free as a Bird and Real Love, songs that felt like the Beatles reaching across death itself to finish something important. Their disagreements during those sessions were real. Paul wanted the songs to sound unmistakably like the Beatles. George leaned toward simplicity, toward his own melodic instincts, toward something a little quieter and more personal. They argued over solos. They argued over the feel of certain lines. But somehow, as they always had in the best of times, the music got done, and it was good. George Harrison's final years were marked by illness, a throat cancer diagnosis in 1997, treatment, a violent and terrifying knife attack at his home in 1999 that left him physically weakened, then lung cancer spreading, then eventually a brain tumor. He faced all of it with the kind of spiritual equanimity that had defined his inner life since India. He had been preparing for this, in some sense, for decades. Paul visited when he could, and one of those visits, the last one by all accounts, took place at a clinic near New York where George was receiving treatment. Paul McCartney has spoken about this visit, and when he does, his voice changes. Something drops away. The performer disappears, and just a man is left. I sat with him for a few hours when he was in treatment just outside New York. McCartney said in an interview with Uncut magazine, he was about 10 days away from his death, as I recall. We joked about things, just amusing, nutty stuff. It was good. It was like we were dreaming. He was my little baby brother, almost because I'd known him that long. And then he said the thing that stopped everyone who heard it. We held hands. It's funny, even at the height of our friendship, as guys, you would never hold hands. Paul planted it by the gate of his home. And in the years since George's death, that tree has become something more than a tree. George was very into horticulture, a really good gardener. Paul told NPR's All Things Considered, so he gave me a tree as a present. It's a big for a tree and it's by my gate. As I was leaving my house this morning, I get out of the car, close the gate and look up at the tree and say, "Hi, George." There he is, growing strongly. He went on, "It's lovely. He gave it to me, so I just planted it. But then, as the years go by, every time I look at it, I go, that's the tree George gave me. George has entered that tree for me. I hope he's happy with that. George has entered that tree for me." That is not the kind of thing you expect to hear from one of the most commercially successful musicians in history. It is tender. It is a little mystical. It is completely sincere. And it tells you everything you need to know about how far Paul McCartney has traveled in his understanding of George Harrison. From the studio boss who didn't always make room for his youngest bandmate, to the old man who greets his friend's spirit in a fir tree every morning he leaves the house. In 2026, Paul McCartney released his album The Boys of Dungeon Lane, and the ghost of George Harrison runs through it. The album is McCartney's most reflective in decades, a collection of memories from Liverpool, from the early days, from the friendships that shaped him. His lead single, Days We Left Behind, looks back on the adventures he shared with Lennon and Harrison long before any of them were famous. I still get a little bit emotional talking about John and George. McCartney admitted in the build-up to the album's release. He was not performing emotion. He was reporting it accurately from somewhere deep inside. One story he has told while promoting the album involves a memory he shared with Olivia Harrison, George's widow. Paul recounted an old adventure he and George had as young men, a mishap involving a zip and a motorcycle battery, a silly, embarrassing story from their hitchhiking days. He told it to Olivia, and she looked at him and said, "Yeah, George told me that story about you getting your zip stuck in the battery." Paul insists it was George. The details don't matter. What matters is that these two boys were so close for so long that they told the same story from opposite sides of it, and both versions survived them. That is friendship. That is the thing Paul McCartney is finally, fully, openly mourning. Not the musical genius. Not the Beatle. The boy on the bus. The kid who played guitar until his fingers bled. The friend he once underestimated and then lost, and then found again in a hospital room where two grown men held hands as if they had never stopped being teenagers on a Liverpool morning. Paul McCartney did not always get George Harrison right. He was controlling when he should have listened. He was dismissive when he should have made room. He let years pass in cold silence that could have been warmed by a phone call. These are the kinds of regrets that cannot be undone, only acknowledged, and acknowledge them he has. Not in one grand gesture, not in a public apology or a weeping confessional, but slowly, in a way that honest people deal with complex emotions, piece by piece, in interviews and albums and songs, in quiet mornings by a gate, where a man looks up a fir tree and says hello to his little baby brother. George Harrison once told Paul McCartney, in those final years, when fences were being mended, that he didn't want to carry old grievances around for the rest of his life. He had watched John Lennon die before they had fully reconciled, and it haunted him. He did not want the same thing to happen with Paul. That generosity, that spiritual clarity, was pure George, and it was enough. It gave them those last years. It gave them that hospital room. It gave them that held hand. Paul McCartney has finally broken his silence about George Harrison and what he has said in fragments over many years through music and memory and a fir tree growing strong by his gate. Is this, I didn't always see you clearly. I underestimated you. I took up too much room. But you were my little baby brother, and I have been talking to you every morning since you left, and I intend to keep doing so. Some silences, when they finally break, say more than any words ever could. What is your favorite George Harrison song? And do you believe Paul McCartney finally did justice to George's legacy? Let us know in the comments.